Mike Flynn was forced out as President Trump's first national security advisor 3.5 weeks into the start of the new administration. He didn't even make it a month. After he got forced out in scandal, you might remember that Mike Flynn retroactively registered with the federal government for having been a foreign agent. He had been paid, it turns out, about $500,000 by a foreign government, by the government of Turkey, while he was part of the Trump campaign. When he finally, months later, retroactively registered as having been a foreign agent during the campaign, that made some other things make sense. We had known, for example, that on Election Day, Mike Flynn had published a very strange, over-the-top op-ed in the Hill newspaper. It argued against a Turkish cleric who lives in the United States. He's a legal U.S. resident. He has a green card. Flynn's op-ed, again, published on Election Day, compared this Turkish guy to Osama bin Laden and said that the United States should definitely hand him over to Turkey. Now, the authoritarian government in Turkey blames this guy in the U.S. for pretty much all of their problems. He's their universal boogeyman. They blame him for an attempted coup back in 2016. They blame him for everything. So it was a little weird that somebody from the Trump campaign was arguing, yeah, hand him over. Give him to the Turks, right? But that was Mike Flynn. It was a little weird. Then it got weirder. There were reports in the Wall Street Journal that Mike Flynn had had meetings with officials from the Turkish government in late 2016, at which they discussed basically kidnapping that Turkish guy, kidnapping him and flying him on a private jet to a Turkish prison island. For this scheme, Mike Flynn and his son would reportedly be paid as much as $15 million. That was the little side project he was working on while he was on the Trump campaign, before he became national security advisor. Now, Flynn's lawyer has said those allegations are false. Then NBC News further reported that in the weeks following Trump's inauguration, after Flynn took office as national security advisor, a request was made to the FBI to, hey, let's look into sending that cleric back to Turkey, that exiled cleric. He's got a green card to live in the United States. He's a legal permanent resident of this country. He has lived in Pennsylvania for 20 years. He lives in the Poconos. The U.S. generally doesn't hand over political exiles who are legal permanent residents of this country, who are not known to have committed any crimes in this country. We don't usually hand over endangered exiles to authoritarian regimes who are demanding their return because they blame them for the sun rising. But this week, NBC News reports that the Trump administration, once again, is going after this guy, trying to send this guy over to Turkey. Trump administration officials last month asked federal law enforcement agencies to examine legal ways of removing exiled Turkish cleric Fethullah Gulen in an attempt to persuade Turkey's president to ease pressure on the Saudi government. The White House is looking for ways to placate Turkey over the murder of U.S. journalist Jamal Khashoggi, according to 2 senior U.S. officials and 2 other people briefed on the requests. NBC continues, quote, career officials at the agencies pushed back on the White House requests. As one senior U.S. official described it, quote, at first there were eye rolls, but once they realized it was a serious request, the career guys were furious. Joining us now is somebody who knows how things are supposed to work inside the administration or inside any administration on an issue like this. He knows what normal looks like in a circumstance like this. David Laufman was a longtime civil servant and prosecutor at the Department of Justice. In February, he resigned as the head of the Justice Department's counterintelligence and export control section. Mr. Laufman, thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Good to be with you, Rachel.
So one of the things I raised here was Mike Flynn registering retroactively as a foreign agent around the time that after the time that he left the Trump administration. But the other issue here is the question of this U.S. green card holder, this man who is a legal U.S. resident. The government of Turkey has been demanding that he be handed over by the U.S. to Turkey so they can go after him for lots of different things. How are issues like that usually handled as a matter of U.S. law enforcement?
Well, a formal request for extradition by a foreign government would be put into a process that's well established within the Justice Department. Career officials within the Office of International Affairs and elsewhere within the department would evaluate the validity and legitimacy of the request, determine whether it in fact reflects a lawful charge under Turkish law, and then an assessment would be made of whether that same offense charged in Turkey is also an offense under U.S. law, because there has to be something called dual criminality in order for the United States to be in a position to extradite someone here to Turkey. That wouldn't be the end of the process, though, if the individual could lodge something called a political offense claim, claiming that the request from Turkey is really politically motivated. Then there are defenses that could be asserted to preclude extradition.
In terms of this particular cleric, it's been widely reported that there have been multiple reports from the Turkish government and multiple forms of pressure from the Turkish government that they really want to get their hands on him. They want this. They want him to be extradited. And whether that's taken the form of formal extradition requests or whether that's taken the form of political pressure and lobbying, I think depends on the account. But is this a specific person who the U.S. government has considered in the past in terms of these Turkish requests and Turkish pressure, and that the U.S. has in the past decided no, he shouldn't be handed over?
Well, I think the reporting you described indicates that there already has occurred a careful vetting by Department of Justice officials, career officials who do this for a living, and an assessment made that there wasn't sufficient grounds for extradition. And what appears now, if this new reporting is true, is that the White House is attempting to strong-arm career officials at the department and elsewhere at other agencies into manufacturing a grounds to remove Mr. Gulen to Turkey or elsewhere.
That is absolutely what the reporting says. If, in fact, this reporting is accurate, I just have to ask your assessment as somebody who's been there and who's dealt with these sort of things. How big a deal is this? I mean, how unusual is this? And how loudly would you expect people in the agencies, including the Justice Department, to squawk over this kind of pressure from the White House to reverse the decisions, reverse the views of career officials who work on these things as a professional matter?
I think it would be unusual if the facts as reported were true. As I said, there's already been reportedly a very careful vetting of the validity of the Turkish government's request. And this is maybe not even a second bite of the apple, but a third or fourth bite at the apple. And so it appears that they're just trying to create a pretext under some set of facts to eject Mr. Gulen out of the United States in order to placate the Erdogan regime, to soothe its current hostility toward the Saudi government, in order to appease a regime that our own intelligence community has alleged now has committed one of the grossest human rights atrocities in modern memory.
David Laufman, the former chief of the Justice Department's Counterintelligence and Export Control Section. It's always an honor to have you here, sir. Thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Rachel.
The framing that Mr. Laufman just put on that there, I think, just shouldn't be skipped over. I mean, what NBC is reporting here is that if you combine this with the new reporting from the Washington Post, that the CIA says that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia ordered the murder of this U.S. journalist. Crown Prince orders that. U.S. journalist gets murdered. Turkey raises the alarm about it and says, you know, we've got evidence that happened. That happened on our soil, happened in our country. We think Saudi Arabia did it. Now the U.S. is offering, what can we give you, Turkey, in order to make you stop making so much noise about what Saudi Arabia did here? How can we placate you and calm you down and quiet you down in your upset over what Saudi Arabia did here? Jamal Khashoggi was a U.S. resident, worked for the freaking Washington Post. He was a U.S. journalist. We ought to be the ones who somebody's trying to placate here. We shouldn't be. I mean, if the Saudis did this, and if the CIA knows that the Saudis did this, we're trying to keep other people quiet from complaining about Saudi doing this. And in doing so, we're maybe going to hand over somebody who we're pretty darn sure they're going to torture and kill once he gets there. What dystopian movie is this? I'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.